The morning sun barely touched the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains when Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her gear one final time. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing just 118 pounds, she looked almost fragile next to the towering Navy SEALs she was assigned to support. The Special Operations team had been skeptical when command told them their medic would be a woman, especially one who looked like she could blow away in the mountain wind. Lieutenant Commander Jake, the team leader, had voiced his concerns privately to his superiors. This was going to be a dangerous reconnaissance mission deep in Taliban territory. They would be hiking through some of the most treacherous terrain in Afghanistan, where one wrong step could mean death. The last thing he needed was to worry about protecting someone who might not be able to keep up. Maria had heard the whispers, seen the sideways glances. She had dealt with doubt her entire military career. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had been the smallest kid in her class, often overlooked and underestimated. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination and an iron will that had been forged through years of proving herself. The mission briefing was straightforward on paper, but deadly in execution. Intelligence had located a high-value Taliban commander in a remote village nestled between two mountain ranges. The team's job was to conduct surveillance, gather intelligence, and if possible, capture or eliminate the target. They would be inserted by helicopter at night and would have to hike 15 miles through enemy territory to reach their objective. As the Chinook helicopter lifted off from forward operating base Chapman, Maria felt the familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. She had been on dozens of missions, but this one felt different. The intelligence reports indicated heavy Taliban presence in the area, and recent attacks on coalition forces had put everyone on edge. The team consisted of 6 highly trained SEALs and Maria. Each man carried between 60 and 80 pounds of gear, weapons, and ammunition. Maria's medical kit alone weighed 45 pounds, but she also carried her rifle, body armor, and survival equipment. Despite her small frame, she had trained relentlessly to build the strength and endurance needed for these missions. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings. The team quickly disembarked and began their trek toward the target location. The terrain was unforgiving, with loose rocks that could give way without warning and steep inclines that tested even the most physically fit soldiers. For the first few hours, the team moved in relative silence, communicating through hand signals and staying alert for any signs of enemy activity. Maria kept pace without complaint, her breathing steady despite the thin mountain air and heavy load she carried. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped significantly. The wind picked up, creating a howling sound that echoed through the valleys below. Visibility became limited as clouds rolled in, and the team had to rely more heavily on their night vision equipment and GPS systems to navigate. Around midnight, they reached their first checkpoint, a small cave system that provided temporary shelter from the elements. The team took turns resting while others maintained security. Maria used this time to check her medical supplies and review the emergency procedures she might need to implement if things went wrong. Lieutenant Commander watched her carefully during these quiet moments. He had to admit that she had kept up better than he had expected, but the real test would come when they encountered enemy contact. Combat was unpredictable, and he wondered if she would be able to handle the chaos and violence that might follow. The second phase of their journey took them along a narrow ridge line that offered strategic views of the surrounding area, but also exposed them to potential enemy observation. They moved slowly and deliberately, using natural cover whenever possible and constantly scanning for threats. It was during this phase that they encountered their first sign of Taliban activity. Fresh footprints in the dirt indicated that enemy fighters had passed through the area recently. The team immediately went into high alert mode, weapons ready and senses heightened. Maria felt her heart rate increase as the reality of their situation became clear. They were deep in enemy territory, miles from any support, and potentially walking into a trap. But her training kicked in, and she focused on her breathing and maintained her position in the formation. As dawn approached, they reached their final destination, a rocky outcropping that provided an excellent view of the target village below. The SEALs began setting up their surveillance equipment while Maria established a small aid station in case anyone was injured during the operation. Through their scopes, they could see the village coming to life as the sun rose. Women were drawing water from wells, children were playing in the streets, and men were going about their daily routines. It looked peaceful, but intelligence indicated that somewhere in that village was one of the most wanted Taliban commanders in the region. The team settled in for what could be a long wait. Surveillance operations sometimes lasted for days, requiring patience and discipline to maintain their position without being detected. They rotated shifts for observation duties while others rested or maintained their equipment. As the day progressed, they began to identify potential targets moving through the village. Several men matching the description of their primary target were spotted, but positive identification would require more time and observation. It was late in the afternoon when everything changed. A shepherd boy, no more than 12 years old, was leading his goats along the hillside when he spotted something unusual among the rocks. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he moved closer, he realized he was looking at the barrel of a rifle. The boy's shout of alarm echoed across the valley, immediately alerting the entire village to the presence of intruders. Within minutes, armed Taliban fighters began pouring out of buildings and taking defensive positions throughout the village. Lieutenant Commander cursed under his breath as he realized their cover had been blown. The mission had just transformed from a surveillance operation into a potential firefight, and they were outnumbered and surrounded by hostile territory. Maria felt a surge of adrenaline as she prepared for what might come next. All her training, all the doubt and skepticism she had faced, had led to this moment. She gripped her rifle and waited for orders, knowing that the next few hours would test every member of the team in ways they had never been tested before. The Taliban fighters were organizing quickly, and it was clear that they had experience dealing with coalition forces. Radio chatter indicated that reinforcements were being called in from neighboring villages, which meant the team's situation was about to become much more dangerous. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the stage was set for a confrontation that would push Maria Santos and her teammates to their absolute limits. None of them knew that before this mission was over, the tiny female soldier they had doubted would become their salvation. The first shots rang out just as darkness settled over the mountain village. Muzzle flashes lit up the evening like deadly fireflies as Taliban fighters opened fire from multiple positions. The SEAL team immediately took cover behind the rocky outcropping, returning fire while trying to assess their situation. Lieutenant Commander quickly realized they were in serious trouble. Intelligence estimates had been wrong about enemy numbers. Instead of a small Taliban cell, they were facing what appeared to be an entire company of fighters, possibly 40 to 50 men who knew the terrain better than they did. Maria pressed herself against the cold stone, her medical training taking over as bullets whined overhead. She could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds impacting the rocks around them, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. Her first priority was to keep track of her teammates and be ready to provide medical aid if anyone was hit. Sergeant First Class Tommy, the team's communications specialist, was trying desperately to establish contact with their base. The mountains were interfering with radio signals, and every attempt to call for extraction or air support resulted in static. They were on their own, surrounded by enemy fighters who were systematically closing off their escape routes. The firefight intensified as Taliban reinforcements arrived from the neighboring villages. Rocket-propelled grenades began exploding near their position, shaking the ground and filling the air with debris and smoke. The SEALs returned fire with precision, but their ammunition was limited, and they could not sustain this rate of fire indefinitely. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the team's explosives expert, took a bullet through his left shoulder during the first 15 minutes of combat. The impact spun him around and slammed him against the rocky wall behind their position. Blood immediately began soaking through his uniform as he struggled to maintain consciousness. Maria did not hesitate. Despite the bullets flying overhead, she low-crawled to Williams' position, her medical kit bouncing against her back. Training had taught her to work under fire, but the reality was more chaotic and terrifying than any simulation. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. She quickly assessed Williams' wound while keeping her head down to avoid sniper fire. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting any major arteries or bones, but he was losing blood rapidly and going into shock. Working by feel more than sight, she applied pressure dressings and administered morphine to manage his pain. The situation continued to deteriorate as enemy fighters managed to get above their position on the surrounding ridges. Now they were taking fire from multiple directions, making it nearly impossible to maintain effective defensive positions. Lieutenant Commander knew they had to move, but Williams was in no condition for a fighting withdrawal. That was when Petty Officer Second Class David stepped on an improvised explosive device while trying to move to a better firing position. The explosion threw him 20 feet through the air and left him unconscious with severe injuries to both legs and possible internal trauma. Shrapnel had torn through his body armor and embedded itself in his chest and abdomen. Maria found herself treating two seriously wounded teammates while under constant enemy fire. Injuries were life-threatening and required immediate attention, but moving him would be extremely dangerous for both of them. She made the decision that would define her military career. She would stay with the wounded regardless of the personal risk. Working with incredible speed and efficiency, she stabilized bleeding and established an airway to help him breathe. His pulse was weak and thready, indicating severe blood loss and possible internal injuries. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would not survive the night. The tactical situation had become hopeless. The remaining 4 able-bodied SEALs were running low on ammunition, and enemy fighters were closing in from all sides. Radio communications remained impossible, which meant no chance of air support or extraction. Lieutenant Commander made the hardest decision of his career. They would have to attempt a fighting withdrawal and carry their wounded teammates to safety. The plan was ambitious and desperate. They would use their remaining grenades to create a diversion, then move down the opposite side of the mountain under cover of darkness. It would mean traveling through unknown terrain while carrying 2 seriously injured men, but staying in their current position meant certain death for everyone. Maria knew that carrying in his condition could kill him, but leaving him behind definitely would. She rigged an improvised stretcher using equipment straps and parts of his body armor, then secured his medical equipment to her own pack. The additional weight would slow her down significantly, but there was no alternative. The withdrawal began just after midnight. The remaining SEALs provided covering fire while Maria and Williams, despite his own injuries, carried down the rocky slope. Every step was treacherous in the darkness, with loose stones threatening to send them tumbling into the valley below. Taliban fighters pursued them relentlessly, using muzzle flashes and night vision equipment to track their movement. The team was forced to stop frequently to return fire and prevent themselves from being overrun. Each halt meant more precious time lost and increased the chance that would not survive his injuries. 3 hours into their escape attempt, Williams collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. His shoulder wound had reopened during the difficult movement over rough terrain, and he could no longer help carry. Maria now faced the impossible task of helping 2 wounded men while keeping up with the retreating team. Lieutenant Commander ordered the team to establish a defensive perimeter in a small depression that provided some cover from enemy fire. They would make their stand there and hope that daylight would bring the possibility of air support or rescue. But privately, he knew their chances were slim. Maria worked frantically to keep both men alive as enemy gunfire continued to snap overhead. Drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing hour. Williams was stable but weak from blood loss and unable to move without assistance. As dawn approached, the team's ammunition was nearly exhausted. They had maybe 30 rounds between them and no hope of resupply. The Taliban fighters had maintained pressure throughout the night and showed no signs of giving up the pursuit. It was then that Maria Santos made a decision that would shock everyone, including herself. She volunteered to carry to safety, while the others provided covering fire for as long as possible. The distance to friendly territory was approximately 8 miles through some of the most difficult mountain terrain in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander initially refused to consider the plan. Maria was the smallest member of the team and outweighed her by more than 60 pounds. The idea of her carrying him 8 miles through enemy territory seemed like suicide for both of them. But Maria had already made up her mind. She had sworn an oath to preserve life, and she would not abandon a teammate to die in these mountains. Looking directly in the eyes, she told him that she was going with or without permission. Her tone made it clear that this was not a request. The team spent their last few grenades creating a diversion on the opposite side of their position. While enemy attention was focused there, Maria began the most challenging journey of her life. With secured to her back in an improvised carry system, she started down the mountain slope toward what she hoped would be salvation for both of them. The weight of David's unconscious body pressed down on Maria's shoulders like a mountain of lead. Every step sent shooting pains through her legs and back, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, the sound of gunfire continued as her teammates fought to give her as much time as possible to escape with the wounded SEAL. The improvised carry system she had rigged was cutting into her shoulders despite the padding she had added. Weighed 185 pounds, nearly twice her own weight, and his gear added another 40 pounds to the load. Basic physics said this was impossible, but Maria had stopped believing in impossible when she decided to join the military. The first mile was the steepest, requiring her to navigate down a rocky slope in near-total darkness. Every loose stone could mean a fatal fall for both of them. She tested each footstep carefully, feeling for solid ground before committing her full weight. His breathing was shallow and irregular, reminding her that his life depended entirely on her ability to get him to medical help. Halfway down the slope, she heard voices speaking in Pashto echoing off the mountainside. Taliban search parties were spreading out to hunt for survivors from the firefight. She would have to avoid detection while carrying an unconscious man through territory that the enemy knew far better than she did. Maria found a small cave formation and dragged inside, covering the entrance with loose rocks and vegetation. His pulse was getting weaker, and she knew that internal bleeding was slowly killing him. She administered another dose of morphine and checked his bandages, trying to stop the bleeding that was soaking through his uniform. For 20 agonizing minutes, she listened to Taliban fighters moving past their hiding spot. Their voices grew closer, then farther away as they searched the immediate area. Moaned softly in his unconscious state, and Maria had to cover his mouth to prevent any sound that might give away their position. When the voices finally faded into the distance, she knew she had to keep moving. Every minute of delay decreased chances of survival, and dawn would bring increased enemy activity in the area. She repositioned him on her back and emerged from the cave, continuing her descent toward the valley floor. The second mile took her through a dried riverbed filled with loose rocks and hidden obstacles. In the darkness, she stumbled repeatedly, each fall jarring his injured body and threatening to worsen his condition. Her own body was beginning to show the strain of carrying such a heavy load over difficult terrain. Her knees began to give out from the constant stress, and her breathing became labored in the thin mountain air. Sweat poured down her face despite the cold temperature, and her muscles screamed in protest with every step. But quitting meant watching die, and that was not an option she was willing to consider. As she reached the valley floor, the terrain became somewhat easier to navigate, but new dangers emerged. This area was known to contain improvised explosive devices planted by Taliban fighters to target coalition patrols. One wrong step could kill them both instantly, but there was no alternative route that would get to medical help in time. She moved even more carefully now, watching for any signs of disturbed earth or unusual objects that might indicate buried explosives. The process was painstakingly slow, but life was worth the extra caution. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she could feel his body growing cooler against her back. During the third mile, briefly regained consciousness. His first words were asking her to leave him behind and save herself. The request hit Maria like a physical blow, but she immediately rejected it. "No one gets left behind" was more than just a military slogan to her. It was a sacred promise that defined who she was as a soldier. Tried to argue that she was risking her own life for someone who probably would not survive anyway. His injuries were too severe, and the distance to safety was too great. But Maria simply adjusted his position on her back and kept walking, telling him that she had carried heavier things farther than this. The conversation used what little strength had left, and he soon lost consciousness again. But during those few minutes of clarity, something had changed between them. He understood that this tiny woman was risking everything to save his life, and his respect for her courage was absolute. The fourth and fifth miles took Maria through a series of small villages that had been abandoned due to the ongoing conflict in the area. The empty buildings provided some concealment from enemy patrols, but they also presented new dangers. Taliban fighters often used abandoned structures as bases for operations or weapons caches. She moved carefully through the ghostly settlements, staying in the shadows and avoiding open areas where she might be spotted. The weight of his body was becoming almost unbearable, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Rest would mean certain death for both of them. In one village, she discovered a small medical clinic that had been ransacked but still contained some useful supplies. Working quickly, she found intravenous fluids and administered them through a catheter in his arm. The additional medical support bought them more time, but his condition remained critical. The 6th mile brought new challenges as the terrain became rockier and more difficult to navigate. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she had to stop frequently to prevent herself from falling. Each rest period was a calculated risk between her physical limitations and medical needs. During one of these breaks, she heard helicopters in the distance. For a moment, hope flared in her chest as she thought rescue might be approaching. But the aircraft were flying in the wrong direction, probably responding to the firefight at their original position rather than searching for survivors. She used her emergency radio to try establishing contact with the helicopters, but the mountains interfered with transmission just as they had earlier. The frustration was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Getting to safety was still her responsibility, regardless of whether help was coming. The 7th mile pushed Maria beyond her physical and mental limits. She was running on pure willpower now, her body having exhausted its normal reserves hours ago. Her vision blurred with fatigue, and she began to hallucinate slightly from dehydration and stress. His condition was becoming critical. His breathing was so shallow that she had to check repeatedly to make sure he was still alive. Blood loss and internal injuries were slowly killing him despite her medical interventions. She knew that if she did not reach help soon, all her efforts would be in vain. As she climbed over a rocky ridge, she saw lights in the distance that looked different from village fires or enemy positions. The pattern was too organized, too military in appearance. With her heart pounding with renewed hope, she realized she was looking at forward operating base shank, approximately 1 mile away. The final mile was the longest of her life. Knowing that salvation was within reach made every step more painful, every minute more agonizing. Her body wanted to collapse, but her mind drove her forward with thoughts of life hanging in the balance. Security personnel at the base spotted her thermal signature on their night vision equipment when she was still several hundred yards away. At first, they thought they were seeing an enemy fighter carrying supplies or weapons. It was not until she got closer that they realized they were looking at an American soldier carrying a wounded teammate. The base erupted into controlled chaos as medical personnel rushed to meet her. Was immediately taken to the trauma center where surgeons worked to save his life. Maria collapsed the moment his weight was lifted from her shoulders, her body finally giving in to 8 hours of impossible physical stress. Later, after his condition had stabilized and she had recovered enough to speak coherently, the full story of her incredible journey became known. She had carried a man nearly twice her weight for 8 miles through enemy territory, navigating by starlight and sheer determination. The SEALs who had remained behind to cover her escape were eventually extracted by helicopter after calling in airstrikes on the Taliban positions. When Lieutenant Commander learned what Maria had accomplished, he was speechless. The tiny soldier he had doubted had just completed one of the most remarkable rescues in military history. Survived his injuries and made a full recovery, thanks entirely to Maria's refusal to leave him behind. Her actions earned her the Silver Star, but more importantly, she had proven that courage and determination matter more than size when lives are on the line. The story spread throughout the military community, inspiring countless others and changing perceptions about what female soldiers could accomplish. Maria Santos had not just saved a life that night. She had shattered stereotypes and opened doors for future generations of women in combat roles. Years later, when people asked her how she managed to carry a man twice her size 8 miles through the mountains, Maria would simply smile and say that the weight of leaving someone behind would have been much heavier to carry for the rest of her life.